Yeah, we are live. Hello, everyone. Good evening for those joining us from India, and good morning to those joining us from elsewhere. And I'm happy to have with me here Rupa Viswanath, author of a book, Pariah Problem: Caste, Religion, and Social and Colonial India and Post-Colony. I'd like to start off with this quote about William Faulkner teaches us that the past is never truly the past. And then the other popular quote is from George Santayana, which says, you either learn from history or you're condemned to repeat it. Mm-hmm. And so much that happens today in the Indian society could be explained or understood better by going back to the past. Understood why some of the issues are happening the way they're happening, and how to understand them better is through understanding the past and learning about the past. First, you have to learn and then make sense out of the past, and then address what is happening today. Why are the Dalits, who are at the forefront of many issues today, and the Dalit leadership is at the forefront of many issues? How are these issues framed? How much of the past echoes within us, within what's happening today? And it is with this aspect that we come to Rupa's book, which kind of takes off from where Dharma Kumar's famous other legendary book, Land and Caste. Land and Caste is probably one of the most popular works, which tied the land ownership inextricably and completely with how caste structure was in Tamil Nadu. And Rupa's book takes that further and explains how, in the colonial era, the three actors, the landowners who happen to be what are called upper caste, and then the missionaries who had just then come into Tamil Nadu in a big way, and the colonial administration. And we start this off around 1890 with Tremenhere's report on Chengalpet, and then trace it for 30 years, which Rupa considers as the frame which sets the dialogue for the years after. And this is where I'd like to start off by inviting Rupa, and Rupa a few words, and then we could get on to the topics.
Okay. Thank you so very much, Aravindan, for giving me this chance to talk about the book and the issues that it raises, and especially to bring up, as you said, the ways that, the past, which I did all this research on, is still very much shaping the politics and political economy of the present today in Tamil Nadu. And so just to kind of give people an idea of the main issues involved that I hope we'll be talking about today. One is about kind of the nature of the relationship of Dalits to religion. So, Aravindan called this segment Governing Dalits, Religion and the State. That turns out to be a critical piece in the way that Dalits came to be governed, with consequences that are bad, let's say. So that's the main issue also. And just to kind of echo Aravindan's point from Santayana, that is also was my primary motivation, right, for even doing this research, is starting with a condition, a set of circumstances in the present that you think is just outrageous, intolerable, unjust. How did it get to be this way? Why is it this way? And are the ways that we think we're solving it right? Are they justified? Do they have any basis in things that have happened before? Are we, as you said, are we repeating mistakes? These were kind of my guiding questions, but
Thanks. And an explanatory note before we go further, right? Throughout this program, we are going to be talking about castes, and some of whom will be, if anyone was writing a paper today, we will always say so-called upper caste or so-called, because we certainly don't believe in any of those hierarchies, but the hierarchies exist in the social mind. And and for someone who is not an academic like me, my apologies if I offend someone with a politically incorrect terminology, and pardon me if I'm not using the words so-called always. Just at the very outset, we would like to say that we don't believe in the caste system or the hierarchy that it imposes, but what we believe is immaterial completely. What we are here to talk about is the history that happened as it happened, not even like what we would like to have see it happen or what we want to talk about. We will try to be as clinical as possible, but the only latitude I request of the audience and future viewers is that, pardon me if I slip somewhere with any terminology, particularly speaking for myself as a non-academic. And that takes me to a different, before I go to the question, right? And I often compare the Dalit struggle with the Black liberation struggle. And the titlets of the Pariah Problem, and Rupa and I were just chatting before going live. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the leading lights of the Black liberation struggle in US, his famous tract was, "How does it feel to be seen as a problem?" That was his question in one of his principal works, The Souls of Black Folk. And throughout history, a minority or an oppressed, whether they're minority or majority, sometimes a minority can oppress a majority too. That also is said. So whoever is the oppressed is seen as a problem to be managed, put aside, or whatever. So with this one, I actually wanted to start off with one question to Rupa, which she dilates very early on in the book. The use of the word pariah. Regretfully, American media, I do know, still uses that word a lot. I've seen it throughout the Trump era, where it was, and these are liberal newspapers trying to say, here is this country which has now become an outcast in the Committee of Nations, etc., etc. So pariah is a word that is still very regretfully used commonly in Western media to denote that someone is undesirable or has become undesirable. With that, your first comment that you open the book with is, you explain why you have stuck to using the word. And you straight away, the very first sentence says it, pariah is a cruel word. And then you explain why you used it. So if you could add that.
Yeah, sure. Just to add to what you were saying, it's the most, cruel irony that this term was used to, it's the name of a particular caste in Tamil Nadu, a particular caste that was formerly unfree. It was used as a term by their landlords, by the people who exploited them, to deride them. And what's really sad is that it came into the English language, and its historical meaning is completely unknown. People use it to mean something that deserves to be reviled, something that deserves to be, treated without respect. Something, as you said, that has gone outside the pale of proper behavior. And it's really, I've been involved in various campaigns, many other people I know, trying to get people to stop using that word this way in English, but it hasn't been very successful. But the issue of why I use the term anyway is linked to your remarks about the nature of the ways that states and dominant majorities create communities as problems, and then attempt to, so it's almost as if we could say that every time you hear the word problem, you should become suspicious and imagine that what's actually being done is describing something that is inconvenient to some set of elites, to some set of dominant people, and that what they're trying to do by identifying it as a problem is not solve it in the way that we would hope and expect, but rather to find a way to contain it, to find a way to suppress it. So actually, interestingly, when I was first, getting the book published, I had the term Pariah Problem, the whole phrase, in quotes. And it was very important to me that so you can't separate the two things. The Pariah Problem is a unit, and it was the way that they started to be governed by the state. So I didn't feel like it could be I couldn't switch it to Dalit Problem, because that's not what they understood. They understood Pariah to mean. They understood the nature of untouchability of caste in a specific way that's incorporated in the way they understood the term Pariah. And this whole thing became a problem for them at a particular moment. So it's not that I'm referring just to Parayas, but rather to this problem, which was, the inauguration of a new kind of way to manage labor that would not lead to its emancipation, shall we say.
Absolutely. And which is where I want to take the next question too. The point that you make, particularly in the earliest chapter of your book, is how interlocked land ownership and caste are. And it is not an accident that some castes own land and some castes are prohibited from owning land. Essentially, one becomes the determinant of the other, vice versa. It's almost like a feedback loop of determinant. Land ownership bestows rights on some castes, and being of a caste bestows you a right to own a land. How was this interlocking come about? And also, when we talk about this, one critical point that I want to make, particularly in the setting of Tamil Nadu, is where often oppression is tied only exclusively to the Brahmins. And this comes out from the Dravidian movement that almost made just one community to be the oppressor. But broadly, where does land ownership lie? And then we will talk about the oppressive mechanism. So land ownership and caste as a determinant of each other.
So this is a fascinating question, and there aren't sort of clear answers for every moment in history, but it's certainly the case that status and land ownership were absolutely tied to land. So, for instance, if you take a caste like the Vellalas, right, they are known for both being an upper caste and for being landowning, and in their own self, description, valorize themselves as landlords. So if you look at sort of the, since you were talking about the sort of composition of ownership, it's true that Brahmins were definitely overrepresented among landowners. So they owned around 15% of the land around the turn of the 20th century. So that means 85% was owned by the rest. So that's one aspect to note, right? So
apologies for my interruption.
Yeah.
When you say they're over, they meaning Brahmins are overrepresented.
Yes. So if they own
overrepresented in relation to their population.
Right. Exactly. So if they are demographically 1 to 3%,
even if it was in the Madras state as it was, then maybe 6%, 7%, or even 10%, right? And if you're still owning 15% of the land, you're still overrepresented for your population.
I don't think the population was ever 10%.
It was not.
As far as I'm aware. But in any case, but there was a much stricter correlation. So and then you have, as we know in Tamil Nadu, different regions where there are different so-called dominant castes, right, that own the majority of the land in different areas. But even though there are these differences in the castes that own the land, there is a very clear distinction between everyone who is potentially eligible for ownership and those who are absolutely debarred from it. So if you look from the perspective of land ownership and exploitation of the landless, the major division in society is not between Brahmins and others, but between Dalits and everyone else. The agrarian surplus on which the whole society depended was produced by this one group that were prevented from owning land and lived separately from everyone else. I mean, the most sort of, unmistakable kind of sign, right, of this, the depth of this social cleavage is the fact that in every village today, you still have a cheri and an ur. You still have a Dalit settlement that is kept separate, and nobody questions that. I mean, that's just these are sort of major signs that I think, as social scientists and historians, we should be trying to take seriously, right? There's a whole group of people who are not allowed to own land, made to live apart from everyone else in in extremely horrible circumstances, without the access to any agrarian resources. And then someone else is telling you, no, the main division in society is somewhere else. You should question it.
Absolutely. And this is where also, of course, anyone who is a little familiar with Indian history, or one who has lived a little closer to the villages, which unfortunately was not my experience. So much of it comes for me through reading. I know several friends of mine, for them, some of the words they will readily grasp as hinting at slavery. Pannayal, Adimaya, Padiyal, all of those, right? And whereas the common school graduate coming out of the Tamil Nadu school system may not know how it was practically slavery. Because the moment we say slavery, everyone thinks of America and its slavery problem. It's just not incorrect. It's okay. But we are not aware of how institutionalized and how prevalent slavery was. What is routinely called agrestic laborer. So the laborer and pariah are interchangeable, essentially, because later on, when Adam Andrew was asked by somebody else to make a study on laborers, he immediately interprets it as a study on pariahs, right?
Yes.
So how are can you delve a little bit into the slavery perspective of it, particularly coming into the 1843 abolition of slavery and the trope, as you appropriately call it, the trope of gentle slavery? Because this we hear even today. Like, oh yeah, okay, we had some form of slavery, but it was still not as bad as the lynching or anything. And by the way, I don't want to keep setting up these two things in opposition always, and I'm not here to take up the case of either society, this or that. Every society, and both iniquities had their own
historical logics and
history, right? So this is not about scoring points here or there. That's not the intention. But
no,
we do tend to think whatever happened within the Indian society was gentler. And this is not just a view today. This was a view, as you point out, even during the colonial regime, by the colonial administrators themselves. So talk to us about the trope of the gentle slavery and the actual slavery that happened.
Sure. That's such a great question, and it's so interesting because, as you said, it's interesting. So the first kind of invocation of this idea, that slavery in India is really not like slavery anywhere else. Yes, slavery is bad, but what we have here is not that. That idea, again, it's like you look at who's saying what when, and you recognize, right? So the colonial officials had been, not really talking about it very much, but when they did refer to pariahs, they did talk about slavery. It was fine. Then suddenly, from the metropole, there's all these cries for abolition. And at that point, they say, oh, no, it's not slavery. Please don't, expect us to abolish anything here. We are dependent on this agrarian system for, the cash cow that Madras was. Madras was, producing a lot for the British Empire, and any intervention into its agrarian labor regime would be plain expensive. So the idea of what slavery is, not surprisingly, depends on what those in authority wish to recognize, what they want to legislate about. So it was very convenient for them. They could make sure that Indian slavery just wasn't just what was considered not to count under abolition. And then, of course, you had the whole Indian intelligentsia and elite very eager to also say the same thing. right? That no, this is not really slavery as we have seen it. And of course, the irony is that once you even begin to have a few Dalit voices, or once you look at missionary records, where they had a much closer and more intimate relationship with villagers in India than the state did. They actually went and lived in villages. These things show you that it's totally ubiquitous, that those who were slaves, who were unfree, hated it. They were desperate to get out any moment they could. And so there was just a kind of, and so then the idea that it was gentle was used to sort of stave off abolition for a while. But even when it was finally put in place, this is the other thing that I think was a big revelation for me through the process of doing research, was the extent to which it kind of, when you look at the way a state behaves, you can't just look at what the policies are, right? You have to see whether and how it's actually being enacted, how it's being interpreted, what's actually happening on the ground. So despite the much touted abolition of slavery in 1843, because of the way they had defined the exploitation of Dalits, Dalit slavery was not part of their equation. It was nothing was done about it. And this is even today. There was a recent ethnographic account, in some villages in southern Tamil Nadu where the landowning people referred to some other group as their Adime Kudumbam.
Yeah. And
which means, our slave family.
And here's a good question from a friend, Parthiban Ratnavelu. He actually did read through your book, and he's
Thank you for slogging through
questions. When he asks, how do you relate bonded labor with slavery? One part is the way I remember some of the information there, right? People were bought and sold. So this is the other thing. So this is a crucial distinction between saying whether it was bonded labor versus slavery. Slavery also carries the good distinction of where people are bought and sold like objects. There were rules as to, I think, was it yours or Dharma Kumar, where it was, the rules were also there. Like whether a family should be sold together, whether they should be sold to the nearest Mirasi, and so on and so forth. So how do we distinguish between saying bonded labor versus slavery?
So to a certain extent, some of this is a political question, right? When do we get to call something slavery? So as I said, it can have these, political ways of delimiting it. So from my own, as an academic, what I can say is that slavery, the discourse of slavery in the Anglophone world, the way of studying slavery has been, it takes as its model transatlantic slavery. And that makes it a bit of a problem to understand the rest of the world. So I think scholars are still in the process of trying to kind of extract a concept of slavery from the very North Atlantic focus that it has had. I personally think that, so there are different ways to define slavery. I would say that if you are forced to work, prevented from leaving, and it's also hereditary, that's to me enough of a set of characteristics to call it slavery. And indeed, if you're talking about the way the rest of society understood it, that's what they did call it adime. They called it adime very long after abolition was over, as they still do today. Yeah. So the and then in terms of bonded labor, though, the question that the person posed, I mean, this is very interesting. So there was a type of bonded labor which I talk about in the book, which was called al ademanam. That means you make a mortgage out of yourself and your descendants. So you could call it a bond, but I would call it slavery, I mean, there are languages that the elite, so even this word, al ademanam, it's to me a kind of euphemism for slavery.
And I think, the use of euphemisms to dress up iniquities and oppression, it has a long history. But here is an interesting question, which were there sexual abuse of bonded laborers in those times? Was it common across communities? I am reminded, it's incidental, I was talking about this book on M.G. Ramachandran, the well, he was a popular chief minister, and then there are books after his death. Two of them, one was by his police officer, DGP Mohandas, and the other one was a good study, a reasonable one by M.S.S. Pandian,
The
which
image trap.
the image trap. And in the process of talking about MGR's portrayal of some subaltern characters, Pandian would speak about how in certain places the owner of the land had sexual rights over the laborers, particularly if a laborer got married or something, the conjugal rights was with the landowner. But from a historical perspective, is there something that you have come across? This question was completely
Unexpected.
interesting,
Yes.
and
No, I mean,
gender is not something that you have spoken about in your book, but possibly you have information.
yeah. This was not an issue that was raised a lot in the sources I looked at. Of course, in the post-colonial period, we have enough evidence to know that this was absolutely ubiquitous, right? That sexual abuse, as it is today, is still something that Dalit women suffer, at least in part because of their and their families' dependency on landlords who can wield that power. And I've read lots of ethnography in the post-colonial period where upper caste men and boys talk about Dalit women as if they are a right for them, a source of employment that is not that they don't have to seek consent for. This is pretty ubiquitous, I would say.
And of course, the most famous example from the American side is Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
And Sally Hemings' story, right? It's just impossible not to make that parallel connection there. But the Thomas Jefferson, jumping the gun a little bit, I wanted to take this question that came in, and it also ties in with something that I wanted to make a point about, where Mirastars owned the dwelling place of the Panchamas and the threat of eviction to suppress any stirring of liberty. This is a point that you emphasize. And particularly, I made a connection with there was a recent discussion on Rohit Vemula, particularly where the Dalit students in the university who had depended on the hostel spaces. The eviction from the hostel practically dooms their ability to study in the university. And those are still used methods to control Dalit discussions, Dalit discourses by those in power. So the power of eviction, if you could explain to that point.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Geeta. It's a very, very important question. So it relates back also to what I was just saying before about how to define slavery in a way that that can address more than just transatlantic slavery as its model. To me, if you hold the power over someone's dwelling, which is where they live, where they eat, where they can survive, the only place they can survive, and there's no other kind of employment for them, this is a huge power that you wield over them, which was the most jealously protected form of labor control that these mirasidars exercised. So you find that whenever they were even slightly threatened, there was one interesting case I talk about in my book where a collector just wants to, he's not trying to do anything particularly enlightened. He's just saying, oh, this cheri, this Dalit settlement has become too small. We're going to move it to a different place. And the mirasidar objects so vociferously And the only way you can really understand that is if you know that in this social context, having control over that site was how they ensured their domination. I mean, that and other forms of violence. But if you can literally evict someone and they have no other resources, it's tantamount to killing them, actually.
Absolutely. And you also speak about how runaway laborers can be hunted and brought back. Again, a common feature we see with slavery, right? And George Washington was known to hunt his slaves down who escaped from Vermont. And
Right.
but of course, when he died, he liberates all of them. It's a contradiction there, but it happens. Again, I see this feature of the slavery in the transatlantic area, and essentially people operate the same way. Once they say that this is slavery, this is my property, and once they see it as property, nobody likes to see it escape.
Yeah, it's something you own, right? And there's such a actually, yeah, the incidence, I don't think, was quite the same as in North America of people running away, partly because people run away when they think they have somewhere to go. Where could these people go in Tamil Nadu, right? They're separated, they're minorities in each and every village, they're separated from one another. There's no way there's no capital so that they can just go and settle somewhere else, even though there was land at the time. Right. So there's no other option.
And Lakshmi Ramachandran, who has posed a question saying, like, as Indian society gets less agrarian, can we expect annihilation of caste? Now, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of this question right now, but because we will talk about the path forward or where we see going forward. But I just wanted to acknowledge that the question has indeed come about. But I'll take one thing from Lakshmi's question is you point out specifically that the glorification of agriculture as an agrarian life. And it is very interesting. And that happens because the upper caste own the lands, though they are not actually the tillers of the land.
Right.
They valorize and glorify the agrarian occupation, while the person who is actually doing the work is considered untouchable. And there is a very interesting point here. Jayakanthan, the Jnanpith awarded writer in Tamil, and he actually makes this point, and you have to hear this without rolling your eyes.
Okay.
So he takes the kural, right? Urudundu valvare valvar, toludundu pinselva, mattrorelam toludundu pinselva. Essentially saying it's a farmer. And then he makes this point, which is, unless you subscribe to the Varnashrama Dharma, you cannot assign a primacy to agrarian occupation. And therefore, we have to accept Varnashrama. He accepted it. Okay. He accepted it. And he said, this is how we could honor the agrarian occupation. And you make this connection there, and I thought about Jayaganthan's quote, and incidentally, so essentially, Lakshmi's question in a way ties the agrarian occupation to the caste persistence, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah. It is so fascinating how much, being a tiller of the soil is valorized, like you said, in Tirukural, in so many of the classical Tamil texts, and of course in the 19th century, with the the rise of this kind of Vellala Vellala history writing. But yeah, this is exactly, I guess, the sort of crux of my book, that once you look at the society from the point of view of who is producing what, then your perspective changes, and you see that agriculture is an agrarian production and its organization by people slotted into particular roles by caste has always been the source of production. And you can't even begin to talk about, annihilating caste unless you directly address that.
Absolutely. And good question about the wages received.
Oh God, I mean, wages were sometimes received, sometimes not received. Sometimes, there were different kinds of wages. So people usually distinguish, historians usually like to think about the difference between being paid in kind versus being paid in, so were you paid by, so a padiyal would be paid by the padi, right? A measure of rice. Whereas the Kannaiyan, who was considered to be more tied, would probably have been given cooked food or something like that, right? But as far as I'm aware, I mean, the question of wages, what we mean by wages, like a certain, that was not the nature of the exchange.
Padi are being paid by the padi, the measure, right? There they were cheated.
Yes. So it's not even cheating. It's just like this term al-ademanam. It's like they're euphemisms and everyone knows what's actually going on. But if you come in as a foreigner or something and you think, oh, this is a padiyal, this is a padiyal, they're all getting a padi. But the padi, the measure that's actually used in the villages for Dalits was smaller than the padi measure that was used for everyone else.
Yeah.
And there was it was known, but never made an issue of.
This thing you come again and again, right?
Yes.
Where euphemisms are used and people know what's happening. There is this certain genius for never having written things down, but everyone knows.
Exactly.
And no one would speak of it. No one would speak the truth of it, but everyone knows.
And the state, and you can discern it when you look at the state archive because they act according to those tacit beliefs. So like the idea, like actually it came up with the person's question about agrarian structure. It also is linked to this idea of public goods, right? What is a public resource? What is a public good? What is public space? As I tried to argue in the book, even though the colonial state was using the English word public space, public land, which we all think we know the meaning of, but they very carefully made sure that anytime landed people made a claim to that public land, they gave that, they granted that claim, which means that that things that were called public were not actually for the entire public. They specifically excluded Dalits.
Yeah, absolutely. And my friend makes this point about majority of non-Dalit, and this is true. You also make this point, right?
Yes.
It is, and I think others, Marshall Bhutan and Dharma also make the same point, that it is the Brahmin landowner who is never in the field, whereas the other non-Brahmin landowners do get into the work, but they do use Dalit workers predominantly. So if there is a class of landowners who never step into the land to do work, that is the Brahmins.
Right.
The others do get in some form of work or the other, probably reserving the larger part for Dalits.
I mean, of course it's true that like big Brahmin landowners in Tanjavur would never work, of course. And certainly, but I'm not sure that all non-Brahmin landlords would have, there were very elite aristocratic landlords who also wouldn't have dared to get into the fields, right? But you're absolutely, that's absolutely important, right? So if you're talking absolutely just purely in terms of sort of economic status, there's no doubt there are very poor people from all castes. But I think it's important to recognize this difference because its historical effects are so important, because its historical legacies are so important. And also, I would say nothing against the person who asked the question at all. I don't mean it, towards them, but in general that it's kind of overdetermined to, in the Tamil context, to kind of question the distinction, right?
Absolutely.
And to always insist that the distinction isn't that much of a distinction. And my understanding is, and it may actually have become less of a distinction today or more in different ways. It depends on how you analyze it. But at the time that I'm talking about, there was only one group of people actually prevented from owning land. I think that's really significant.
That's true. And in this context, right, coming into the one thing that leaped out of your first chapter is how Dalits were not considered Tamils. பாறையர்கள் தமிழர்கள் அல்ல அப்படின்ற மாதிரி ஒரு, and then I think you quote Anandarangam Pillai's diary in that context, because this is all the more relevant because there is this constant discourse, particularly within the Dravidian movement, of casting Brahmins who now have been in Tamil Nadu for 2,000 years practically, or probably more well for millennia, right? So to call them as Aryan immigrants, it's a poisonous you can criticize a Brahmin community or Brahminism or anything, but then to cast someone who has been there for ages, from time immemorial almost, to call them as immigrants, whereas now this was a different information coming out from your book, that once upon a time, not too far away, that pariahs were not considered Tamils. And I really would like you to explain that point.
Just about the first issue, the idea that Brahmins were foreigners. I mean, to be fair to the people who say that, there are probably plenty of Brahmins who also think that, right? I mean, plenty of people who pridefully think, oh, I'm, of a different race, of a superior race. These ideas are very common, right, in India, as we know, and among the Brahmins and others who are not in India too. So that there's no surprise there, and that's sort of I would say, a mutual construction between the Brahmins and non-Brahmins. But that idea about race, about Brahmins being a different race, is of course a product of the colonial period, where race thinking and sort of the idea of explaining history in terms of races, was introduced into Indian discourse by different kinds of European intellectuals. But the bigger question that you raised, I think, is actually, you should remind me. I've lost my train of thought for a second because I was interested.
How?
Oh, the Tamil. Yes. So this is really, really important. So, and to go back to the race thing too, right? So whether or not the Aryan race theory is sort of introduced into the colonial period, but even in native understanding, we can see that yes, people thought of Brahmins as different from caste Hindu Tamils. Divided society, understood society as having a tripartite structure of Brahmins, non-Brahmins, and pariahs.
Yeah.
Now, this only, so again, imagine if you were an anthropologist from Mars, you came to Tamil Nadu, that probably wouldn't surprise you. You know what I mean? Because if you looked at the society, you would kind of see that. Whereas it's only something that needs to be explained today in the context of a politics which says, no, it's all the same sort of thing, right? That there isn't a difference. But I think it was extremely powerful and shocking to me when I came across these kinds of references where people, where Dalits themselves, where people writing referred to caste people as Tamils. I've also come across this even in petitions as late as the 1920s, where Dalit people in a village are writing to the colonial state talking about some form of oppression and saying Tamilakal are the ones doing it. And so this is actually there's a funny story about this. So the Tamil lexicon, which is a very important project of the early Dravidian movement. They sell it, in the university. And when I went to buy my copy, when I was just sort of starting fieldwork in the early 2000s, I looked up the word Tamaran. Of course, the name of Ayotidasa's newspaper also, very interestingly, right? So he was making a political claim, I think, when he called it that. Hi, AB.
So he makes the same point.
Yeah. So you see that in the lexicon, but when I went to the Madras University, someone had whited out that meaning of Tamaran. The that the Pariah is not a Tamaran. Someone had crossed that out with the Tipex,
Got it.
So then, white out. So then I thought, oh, that's a little bit strange. I looked at another copy, same thing. Literally every copy, someone had gone to the trouble of covering this up.
Which is also bad, right? So which now robs us of a historical source.
Yeah, because, it's not, to me, it's not a sort of, it's not, if I say at a certain point in history, Pariyas were not considered Tamil, it's not a critique of the concept Tamil, right? You could say today it is a great political concept because it's managed to include people in a new way. The point is that you have to do the work of including, those who were excluded. It can't just be whited out.
To say that they were not considered Tamils once upon a time is okay. And we should hold it as an achievement that we have moved to a stage where anyone can be called a Tamil, including the Tamil diaspora, for example. Right? So that's the point. Now let's shift a little bit into the real meat of the book. Okay. That comes down to the Dalit Conversions, right? Which is there are so many misconceptions about conversions. Yeah. Particularly the Dalit conversions that happened, and even the word conversion, right, which means you wear something and you're becoming something else. But in that, were they truly that before they became this? That's a key question. So how far were they Hindus, and what could be called? And the Dalit historians or Dalit Christian historians, I wouldn't even say Dalit historians broadly, like or even historians of Dalit church movement, like John Webster. He's not Dalit, but still he writes about Dalit Christians, right? And he's Christian, and he talks about the word movement, right? These were actually called movements. So can you set the context of the Dalit conversions? How were the missionaries seeing them? While even I used to subscribe to the view that and here, before we go into the question further, I will also further contextualize this. When we speak about missionaries, church, etc., we are using a very broad term that encompasses chiefly two camps, the Roman Catholic camp and the Protestant camp, right? And when we say that the church was against this or the missionaries were for this, there is a huge difference between the Roman Catholic camp and the Protestant missionary camp, because even I have been prone to say that the missionaries went for the upper caste for conversions. Whereas Webster draws a distinction. He says, it is predominantly the Roman Catholic missionaries who were the first to come, particularly in this 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. But in the 18th century, with the advent of Ziegenbalg, the going after upper caste was not the target of the Protestant missionaries. The Protestant missionaries went after broadly anyone they could get. Whether they were hospitable to the Dalits, whether the church was hospitable, that's a different issue. But the targeted approach of upper caste was a Roman Catholic approach. That was not the Protestant church approach. The Protestant church used it in the educational milieu later. That's a different thing. But so within these, right, and your focus, as you say it out in the introduction piece, right, you are restricting mostly to the Protestant church, because Dalits mostly converted to Protestant church, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
So the context is mostly Protestant church, and within that, and with that, set us the stage for what happened on the conversions and the missionary perceptions of Dalits.
Okay, as you know, that's a really big,
Yes.
question. So the first part of it is just to say something more about Catholic and Protestant. So I think I don't entirely agree with that characterization. So I think it's absolutely true that the Catholics, and they are famous for this, having done, similar things in other countries, famously in China, going for the elites and having a vision of conversion, that the way you do it in a society is you go for the elites and then the masses will follow. This was a perfectly, fine idea to have. So actually, although Protestants didn't openly subscribe to that in the same way as Roman Catholics, when you see what they were doing in their early years, it was trying to reach people that they considered would have an influence on others, right? The idea was to get people who were somehow powerful, and even in some of these schools and colleges, the fancy ones that caste people have gone to, they really were hoping that some of these people would become Christians and that this would set some kind of example for society. And as I talk about in the book, unlike many other places where these, just before I go further, the thing about Protestant missionaries and why I focus on them is not so much because Dalits, so they're obviously very powerful Dalit Catholic organizations and activists today. David Moss has written wonderfully on this. But I was interested in these Protestant missionaries because they were the ones that were connected to the state and made this Pariah Problem emerge. So in a way, it was the Dalits who were being converted by these few missionaries like Adam Andrew and William Gowdy and Sharrock and Clayton and all these people, primarily through the Free Church of Scotland, the Wesleyans, some of the SPG, which is of course not exactly Protestant, being Church of England. But it was these people that were the kind of mediators between, I describe them as mediators because they were pressed by Dalit demands, which I'll get to in a moment, and then they took these to the state. So about the kind of, misconceptions, there's so many on so many levels. So let's start with one, because it's the one that in some ways I would say it marked, it was a very important discovery for me, or not a discovery so much as a kind of instigation to do this research. When you think about this term, which you brought up too, Aravindan, rice Christian, a rice bag Christian. If you think about that, it is, to go back to the word cruel, for people who have probably never been hungry, to decide that they can, understand the inner worlds of very poor, hungry people and denounce them as not being capable of
individual agency,
or higher thought beyond their belly. It's so insulting. And I became very interested in sort of how this term emerged. And it emerged actually as a term of criticism between different missionary denominations. Because Protestantism, as you know, it sets itself up as a religion that is about faith rather than works. It's meant to be about individual belief. And so for them, it was, the worst insult they could imagine if you had converts who were just coming not for your spiritual teachings, but for whatever else you had to offer. The irony that this kind of language has been taken up in India is incredible because sorry, were you going to say something?
It has literally become a euphemism, because today you can't call a person by the caste name, particularly for Dalits. We all know the derogatory caste references. So this has now become a euphemism, because and justifiably, the Indian Christian church is considered predominantly Dalits, and therefore, if somebody threw a dart and said you could be a Dalit towards an Indian Christian, it's largely true. And therefore, in that context, this phrase, rice bag Christian or rice bag convert, has become a euphemism, because they can't call their caste name anymore. It'll attract legal penalties. And now they have resorted to using this as a euphemism.
Right. But the thing is, so if you step back from the Protestant Catholic rivalry, why should anyone do this? It's so cruel to question. It's so let me just go back to the idea of rice Christian. In this context, what makes it so ironic to me is that the majority religion in India, that people now call the majority religion, Hindu, is all about transactions, right? The main Hinduism is about getting things from your God. So why shouldn't everyone do that? Why does it? How can you, decide that wanting material improvement is somehow less purely religious when that is the very basis of so many rituals in Hinduism? I mean, this is a major part. It's not a side, it's not
giving thanks for material
that's what I mean.
that are bestowed.
Yeah, exactly. You're either thanking, you're promising to shave your head if you pass this exam. You're gonna, you make promises in the hope of getting something, and that something is always material.
Yeah, absolutely.
So who are these people to deride having material desires, especially of people who can't even eat?
Exactly. And you make this point rather unambiguously, that the pariahs banged the doors of the church. Literally, that's what you say. And it's not the church went after the Dalits to get converted. And even the conversion was more about, it's not merely about material thing. And this is where the bodily and spiritual poverty that Reverend Kabis draws a point on, right? Which is where you kind of go to how, and this is where also Murray Paul's conversion and how he works with Andrew. And we also see this even in a contemporary manner with the Meenakshipuram conversions, right? Key members of the society become the channels. And again, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not like one Murray Paul or somebody in Meenakshipuram becomes a Muslim and then the entire community follows them. There is dialogue within the community. People often miss this about mass conversions, as if some headman or a strong man gets converted, or that a set of people were allured with temptations, right? Whereas when we go through the individual mass conversion stories, you see a very complex history there.
Yeah. And so part of the euphemizing language of today is to say, oh, here were these Dalit, unfree laborers. They were really happy because it was gentle slavery. Then these missionaries came along. They instigated Dalits to do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise. This is all a lie. It's all completely wrong. So, Dalits were trying to do things with whatever external agency they could manage to get connected to. They tried to do things with the colonial officers if they could manage to get, their attention. They tried to do things with missionaries. They did things with missionaries, whether they converted, ultimately ended up converting or not. That's why in the book I use the phrase, it's kind of awkward, but I say Pariah Missionary Alliance.
Yeah.
Because it's not just conversion. And so how do, and so then it's interesting because I would say that even a lot of the writing on Dalit conversion also then, kind of valorizes the missionary's role as the savior, and also suggests that the reason why pariahs were attracted to them was because they espoused this like amazing egalitarian ideology. I mean, I am absolutely happy to say that they were more egalitarian than the people that pariahs worked for. But the idea that they're sort of, these prophets of egalitarian bliss is just false. And it's not, so some people have said to me, oh, are you against Christians? No, I'm not against Christians. I don't think it's about, first of all, the approach to history where you're sort of giving people certificates for being good or bad, that doesn't really work. But the missionaries were like most people of their time, they believed that inequality of certain kinds was natural. So the thing that was wrong for them with the condition of Dalits was the particular kinds of injustice, cruelty, all the illicit ways that the Mirasidars and other landlords used the state machinery to keep Dalits oppressed. So it's not so much, so I will just...
Yeah. So, and on this point, the egalitarianism and the caste point, right? I'll draw a parallel with Kawashima writing about the missionaries in Kerala. Kerala government, which was the then Travancore regime, was the first one to call itself a Hindu regime. And they were also probably more enlightened than any of the neighboring states. At that time, they declared primary education for all. But having declared that, they did not want to be seen as educating the Dalits, the Yaravas, or whatever the Dalits of the Keralite society were. They didn't want to be seen as educating them directly. So they actually call the missionaries and give them the money and say, you go construct schools and hospitals for Dalits. And then some conversions happen, and then murmurs happen. And then actually they put a stop to that. They say no more conversions in Christian schools, and the hospitals were very extremely rare. That the Christian missionaries were very particular about. But the more interesting component, coming to your egalitarianism part, some of the landowners encouraged the missionaries to convert Dalits in Kerala. The understanding is the missionaries will make them a productive labor force.
Right.
All right. And the missionaries, in turn, were theologically, right? There is a theological aspect to this, where you're supposed to obey your master. And who's the master here? It's the landowner.
Yeah.
So the converted Dalit was taught by the missionaries that the landowner, who could be Hindu and upper caste, is nevertheless a master to be obeyed. So to some extent, these landowners also encouraged conversions. So because theologically, they were not preaching rebellion.
Right. Exactly. On the contrary, they were preaching against rebellion. So when you look closely at the records, so your stereotype is, oh, there were these benighted Dalits. They didn't know how to save themselves. Missionaries came along, showed them the light, embraced them. None of that is true. What really happened is that, Dalits were defiant and, boldly opposing their landlords, not because, but despite missionaries telling them not to, right? Missionaries were trying to warn them, don't do things to antagonize the landlords. And this is something that actually my colleague Joel Lee, whose wonderful book has just come out called Deceptive Majority. He's a fantastic scholar who works on Dalit history too. But his work has also corroborated, that missionaries behaved the same in many of the North Indian provinces where they worked. So this was, as you said, it was part of a theological commitment that, yes, you could raise people up. They shouldn't be, beaten or there shouldn't be injustice, but inequality in itself is not unjust in this view.
And now I want to focus on this part because this is the trajectory that you trace. How the caste system or the being a pariah was tied to religion first, spiritualized, and then socialized, right? Yeah. So the spiritualization of the pariahness, as you call it.
Yeah.
And how far were the missionaries accepting that spiritualization? Because this is where Queen Victoria's edict of religious neutrality really comes in as a very potent weapon to be used by the upper caste. And this was also the weapon used to ensure that caste survives within the church.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So the spiritualization of caste and being pariah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that's, I feel like the main, project of the book is precisely to show all these euphemisms and ways of avoiding any serious solution to the problem. And probably the single most important and long-lived, having the strongest legacy is exactly this that you just pointed out, what I've called the spiritualization. So imagine you have this people who are, tied to the land, abused and exploited, and you say, oh, their real problem is that they are treated as untouchables, and also they have these internal problems. They don't know how to save money, and they need to be educated. It's like you just ignore the most central reason that they're in the condition that they're in. And so, yeah. So this is exactly
this point about the Sharak versus Muttaya Pillai.
Yeah.
Right.
So who gets to count? So what becomes really important because of the colonial state? So the colonial state has this idea that, okay, they're going to not get to, they want to keep the peace, basically. They have to keep the money rolling in. They want to keep a law and order situation. So they're going to try not to bother native elites with their, whatever they're doing with their religion. They decided, it has to do with the 1857 to 58 kind of conflagrations, but the point is that she says, okay, we are not going to interfere with anything to do with the religion of our subjects. They're free to be, they're free in the religious domain. So what does that mean? That means you suddenly have this huge incentive to put all the things that you don't want the state to touch into the religious domain. Right?
Yeah.
You give the people a reason to do this. So, and sure enough, within
everything becomes a custom. Everything gets tied to
everything is religion. It's just our religion. Sorry, it's our custom. It's ancient, and it has to be respected. And it has nothing to do with the economy. It's just, it's religion. And this also means that certain aspects of what it is to be a Dalit become foregrounded, such as untouchability. Right, such as these kinds of what I would call ritual forms of domination become emphasized as opposed to emphasizing their role as exploited people in this labor regime.
Absolutely, and it's interesting this dialogue between Reverend Sharak and one Muttaya Pillai.
It's really interesting.
Interesting because Sharak is very anti-caste more than any of the many others in the Protestant church. And Muttaya Pillai argues about saying, hey, a caste name is not religion. It's more a respect, just as much as you call somebody Sir, Esquire, so on and so forth. Yeah. It's a title, is the argument Muttaya Pillai makes. But what Muttaya Pillai doesn't say is that only the pariahs get to be called by the names and not by the caste. So essentially, one who is not called by a caste suffix is
a pariah.
a
Yeah.
pariah.
The person who is called, he specifically says, so this is just for the audience sake. So, there's this one missionary, Sharak, who kind of, honestly, he's kind of a funny figure because he's so anti-caste. And what's funny about it, in a dark way, is that no one who's in the missionary world agrees with him. So, for instance, he wants to start this caste suppression society, amongst all the SPG churches, and they say, he says, all you have to do is just promise to not use your caste name. Literally, no one is willing to do that. And the reason becomes clear when this elite caste Christian responds to him and says, actually, first he says all that stuff, like you said, oh yeah, our caste name, it's just like, sir, don't make us sound like this. But then, the real issue sort of emerges where he says, actually, the only people who are called without some title are children and pariahs. And we are already, he means other caste Christians, are suffering from the fact that Christianity itself is called Pariah Margam. It's associated with Dalits. So we don't want that. We need to assert our caste identity. And,
And the level to which caste functions, for the sake of the audience. So in Christian marriages, people may be familiar, may not be familiar. There is this system of announcing who's getting married to whom. It's called publishing the banns.
Mm-hmm.
And nowadays it'll be like so-and-so, son of so-and-so is getting married to this daughter. And if anybody has an objection, voice it now or else keep your peace. And this will be announced like 3 times. Back in the days, naturally, the caste suffix was added. All that Sharak wanted to do was drop the caste suffix.
Yeah, no.
And nearly 100 church members leave the congregation. And they write to the bishop of the diocese or something saying, we are permanently leaving the church if he stops saying caste name in publishing the banns. Just the ridiculousness of this shows how caste ingrained the society is.
Yeah.
Wasn't.
And also, and more specifically even, how important it was for a caste person to distinguish themselves from pariahs.
Yes.
Right? So, the context in which he wants to make sure his name is said is one in which if you don't say his name, he'll be thought of as a pariah, because he's a follower of Christianity.
Yeah. And there is an interesting side to Muthaiya Pillai. I don't know if you know this. He is the brother of the most famous songwriter in Christianity,
I did know that.
H. Alfred Krishna Pillai. Yes. And here is the point about H. Alfred Krishna Pillai and Muthaiya Pillai, the Pillai brothers, as we could call them. They were converts. Mm-hmm. And there was a time when, prior to conversion, almost like the story of St. Paul, H. Alfred Krishna Pillai used to persecute converted Christians. He used to take bands of marauders into villages and attack converted Christians.
Wow.
So this is there in a recent book about Alfred Krishna Pillai. And there is I will take a slight digression here, because there is an ongoing conversation called the Dalit Liberation Theology, which is asking the very question as to how did the church's theology and hymnal practices become so Sanskritized. All right, because the early theologians, Chenchaya and so many others, came from upper caste or Brahmin background. Some of them spoke Visishtadvaitam and all, and always try to connect it to Vedic Hinduism and try to explain. So the theology of Indian church, when it became indigenized, first it was Western theology, and then when it became indigenized, it became a Brahminic theology, and in which even the songwriting, and this is where Vedarangam Sastriya will come to his caste side also, and H. Alfred Krishna Pillai's most famous lyric is Sattai Nishkalamai, Sittai Anandamai. That whole song is surfeit with Brahmanic symbolisms.
Yeah,
He was a Vaishnavite. He was a Vaishnavite, H. Alfred Krishna Pillai. And this is where Vedanayagam Sastriyar, another much revered name in Christian liturgy and songwriting particularly. And this also was a recent conflagration by the Carnatic music community, which said, oh, well, why are Christians getting into Carnatic music? Christians didn't get into Carnatic music. Carnatic music has been with the church for ages since, and Vedanayagam Sastriyar was a contemporary of Tyagaraja, all in the Sarfoji time.
Yes.
Vedanayagam Sastriyar plays a crucial part in how the Protestant missionaries accept caste. Because he writes to Bishop Heber, who is on a tour to the southern parts, arguing against caste, and Vedanayagam Sastriyar actually writes like a treatise, justifying caste. Sastriyar, for all his musical talent and stuff, was an absolute casteist person. And he was a prime force in convincing Bishop Heber that it's not a bad thing to have.
And this is the thing that exactly, and so and that doesn't surprise. That's really fascinating, especially about the Pillai brothers. I had no idea about H.A. Krishna Pillai, but the fact that there would be so much justification of caste. I mean, this is something that again, it belies what we usually hear when we think of Christian missionaries. So people either never talk about Christian missionaries, right, or dismiss them, they're anti-Christian, or if they do talk about them, they do see them as the kind of purveyors of egalitarianism. But when you look at what they were saying about caste, a lot of it was very much the same as the views of people like Vedanayagam Sastriyar. Because what they said was, caste is bad because it's connected to Hinduism and it's got heathenish customs, but basically at its heart, it is a division of labor, and it is a good thing, and it's fine in the society to have such a thing. And all we've got to do now is sort of purify it, get it back to its origins. And frankly, that's exactly what Gandhi says, right?
Yeah. Because Gandhi is never anti-caste. It's something we'll come to later. That's a very interesting thing. But before we go there, right, the other big thing is about missionaries, education, and what did they think Dalits should be educated to, the pedagogy for pariahs, as you call it. And particularly the Madras Christian College and Dayanandan's article, if you could elaborate. So while missionaries are, even today, many Indians cutting across political, let's leave the rabble-rousers of a minority. Yeah. By and large, many Indians do look at if at all anybody is asked, what can you say is a signal contribution of Christianity in India? Most would say, without batting an eyelid, it's education.
Yeah.
But then what was the role of missionaries, and where did they draw the line for Dalit education?
So this goes back again to the same issue about what was their vision of society, and was it egalitarian in the ways that we would like to see it? No, it was, it was education that was fitting to one's station. So if you were a Dalit, and the other thing, of course, was that missionaries shared with elite social reformers of all kinds, was the idea of locating somebody's poverty or whatever as, locating the person as the source of their own problems, right? So, one of the people who was, the most committed to converting Dalits also said, that the Pariah's worst enemy is himself. To me, that's a shocking statement if you look at the society, right? No, but so this was what the saviors were thinking,
And here I will share a discussion I had with our friend A.B. Rajsekaran, since he's also online. And ABR, feel free to refute or correct me if I'm misquoting anything, right? Because you make this point that when pariahs got converted, they make usually their demand is for education, and the construction of two things they ask for: one, a chapel in the Cheri, and then a school in the Cheri. And this, I don't know if it's your book or something, some another book which makes this point, that these demands also had a certain angle to it, because these were buildings being put up,
Yeah, that's
which goes against what the upper caste would have tolerated them to do.
exactly. This is an argument that I make. That basically the missionaries also were, so they also didn't fully, in my view, understand what they were doing, right, in the social context. So for them, they're getting these converts who are poor and miserable. They're sort of cleaning them up, giving them nice clothes, whatever, but being not well dressed, looking dirty, having a shabby house. This was part of the way caste people expected Dalits to be. Right? Yeah. Today we have all these things about who gets to ride a horse and who gets to wear this type of clothing, and these are live issues even today, right? So you can imagine at that period, when there is that degree of labor control and that degree of interdependence between the castes, suddenly there may be hardly any pakka buildings even in the Ur at this time. And suddenly the Cheri has a nice little white chapel, a nice, schoolhouse. Some people are wearing shirts. I mean, it's like a slap in the face.
Absolutely. And here I'm going to bring up something, right? So before I go to the point that ABR and I were talking about, I'll make this point first. Uniforms for children. You'll be surprised. I was looking through the Malabarian correspondence that Ziegenbalg has with the natives at that time. This is around 1712 to 1714. I'm looking at the book on the floor. And this was recently brought out. Okay. And the Malabarian correspondence, there are like some 150 letters that he writes to the mission superiors about the dialogues he has had. And the point he makes is that the children getting uniforms was seen by the parents of the Dalit converts as a huge deal. And of course, this rubs the upper caste. And you make this point brilliantly. And again, these things illustrate how violent the society was.
And is, I would say.
Pariahs were ridiculed not by anybody other than a nationalist newspaper, Swadharma, which ridicules a pariah convert just for dressing up.
Yes.
Just for wearing what is considered a decent dress.
And this is supposedly, these are reformers, right? These are reformers. This is a reformist newspaper. They're constantly talking about the plight of the poor and all this stuff. It doesn't strike. So what Aravindan is referring to is a poem that I quote in the book from a magazine, where it's a magazine called Swadharma, as he says, a reformist magazine from the 1920s, and at this time, completely unself-consciously, elites who are supposedly sort of into social improvement and progress just have a poem that mocks. I mean, it's just making fun of someone. It's mocking this person, this pariah who has come out of the Cheri and is, putting on airs, basically.
I really want to read part of this poem.
Sure.
I printed it.
Sure.
And this shows the sheer verbal violence.
Yeah.
The verbal violence is practically chilling. And this is what Swadharma writes about a pariah dressing up. And this is a translation, obviously, by you, I think. Or
no, it's in English.
It's in English. Okay.
Which makes it even more, these are people who knew English. They're so cosmopolitan.
In a Paracheri of Madras, his father, they're talking about one Ramaswamy, okay? His father was a third-rate cook. His mother, she cut grass. Ramaswamy, guiltless, grew to, and he wore an anklet and a rag, but you would hardly call that dress. A zealous cleric then there came on pariah converts bent, and to his little mission school was Ramaswamy sent. Then, clothed in a Christian cap and coat, he learned a fair amount. And so on it goes. His costume should be chic. He therefore donned a collar and tie, then added a waistcoat and a watch with trousers. And now one Mr. Ramsay dwells as well in Padripet. I mean, it's just breathtaking. So it starts by saying, here's this Ramaswamy. His father is a third-rate cook. His mother cut grass. This guy was wearing rags. And he goes to a missionary school. Now he wears a trousers, a waistcoat, and calls himself a Ramsay. And ends with, and he now lives in Padripet. This by a nationalist paper.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is breathtaking. This was exactly the process of my own conversion. Reading this kind of material, I just couldn't believe how outrageous it is. How there are, so it reminded me of even more things. So the fact that, he calls the cleric a zealous cleric. Again, this discourse, the mission, this Ramaswamy is some idiot. He has a third-rate father and a grass-cutting mother. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't even really have any clothes. Then the missionary comes along. And then, of course, when he becomes, dressed up properly, it's not real. It's just an outer shell. The real Pariah is still in there,
Interestingly, Bharadiyar makes a similar a corollary point, because everyone saw the Dalits as the unwashed masses. So Bharadiyar in an essay or a letter writes this: go to these Dalits, bring them out, wash them up, make them wear clean clothes. Hey, Chettiars, please spend your money here. Chettigale, ungal panathai idil selavadiyungal. Okay? So this is what Bharadiyar also writes. Again, I have a different perception of Bharadiyar. I wouldn't club him all together this way. We also should be kind to how people were in a certain time and period and a setting. With that, particularly somebody like Bharadiyar is a little bit more complex than just casting him a certain light. And now when we go to, and there's another thing, which is this, this is an incident quoted by Ayotidas, where somebody carrying an umbrella, a parasol, was attacked because he carried a parasol. And this happened, like 150 years ago.
Yes.
It can still happen today.
Yes.
It still happens today. That's that's where it comes from. That incident is quoted by Ayotidas in Tamilan, and which is what you're quoting, and it still happens today.
Yeah, and this was it was amazing. I wish I could remember the exact way that Ayotidas put it in Tamil, but the way the judge dismissed it, I can't remember but it was just, it was a one line, but of course you can't wear a parasol. Of course that's against the law, Yeah.
And here's, because I have the Kindle edition, I'm able to pull it up. Not that I verbatim remember or anything. I wish my memory was that good. And when the victim went to report this violation in a court, the magistrate dismissed it with brutal candor, you write. And within quotes, you're holding an umbrella by going against customary practice is itself a violation. Case dismissed.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Case dismissed.
So, I mean, it also shows right there, like one of the things that I was saying about the state, that there could be laws, there could be things that are, very lofty principles. There were rules about who could apply for land, for instance, but these were never observed. So when you actually look at what was happening, they were governing according to the old practices of caste.
Yeah.
So you could have a legal system which doesn't recognize custom, but nevertheless, people constantly, making judgments in favor of it.
And
It's
this
like you could, yeah.
invocation of customs and the refusal to interfere on religious neutrality, because like there is another famous case of Maravar Christians, right? They go to court because the Dalits who just became Christians, will start using clay pots instead of palmyra pots, and the Maravar Christians go to court and they say that Dalits have not earned this right because despite their conversion, they are still Dalits. And here's the funny part: the Maravar Christians now cite Hindu law, Hindu custom, and say just by moving to a different religion, the caste restrictions don't go away. And now the judge takes the side of the Maravar Christians and says, you cannot carry a clay pot. You have to carry only a palmyra pot. But again, this case illustrates many things. The level to which their lives were regimented.
Yeah.
Can a dhoti be below an ankle? Can a towel be on a shoulder? Can a woman wear a blouse? So on and so forth, right? The abject slavery, and everything was seen as an avenue to show here is your position in society.
Exactly.
Nothing was too little to be let go.
Yeah, this constant performance of domination, this constant public reiteration of your social position. That's the way I understand, all the sort of village temple festivals, right? What do they do? That's what they're about, is displaying for everyone else what everyone's rank is.
Yeah. And now let's come to land holding Tremenhere's report. Again, right, I want to say this, right? I said this in my clipping also the other day. 15 years ago, if you asked the average person who is Tremenhere, not many would have known. Today, if I'm correct, and somebody can correct me, ABR is still watching, so somebody can correct me. I think Neelam Panbattu Mayam in Chennai has got a statue of Tremenhere.
So awesome.
Right? This guy was barely 40 when he writes that most consequential report, which changes the lives of so many. The Tremenhere report in 1891. So can you give us a flavor of that report?
Yeah.
How did the colonial government respond to it? And then we will take it from there as to particularly to the welfarism state.
Yeah, sure. So Tremenhere was this sort of strange figure. They were he basically became the collector of Chengalpattu, and he was also closely linked to some of the missionaries who were working in the Chengalpattu region. And he was asked to write a report, and what he ended up writing demonstrated that that despite the state's claim, so what he did was very inconvenient, because he didn't just demonstrate, it's called Note on the Parayas of Chengalpattu. He didn't just say what their condition is, which was a very abject one, but he specifically indicted the state for not enforcing the very laws that were supposed to have made landholding more, more democratic, more market-based, essentially, right? So one of their things was to try to sort of expand the market in land, one of the aims of the colonial state. But what Tremenhere showed is that there were ways that landed castes acting together were hoarding land and preventing Dalits from getting it, using the very laws that the colonial state was supposedly trying to change. But as I was saying, even though there's colonial law on the ground, a judge will say you can't violate custom. Likewise, there were all these laws that were supposed to have liberalized landholding, but when you see how any case or any particular decision was made at the level of the village, those things were just completely ignored, and things went according to what the body of Mirasidas wanted. And so what Tremenhere noticed was that any time one of the best things that he really identifies is what he called chicanery, tricks.
Mm-hmm.
Tricks is basically the ways that Dalits would try in so many different ways to try to get a bit of land, right? They might try to get some wasteland that the state was selling. They might try to cultivate something on a garden plot that was behind their house. Anything that they did was systematically undermined. Either, so if they had a small plot of land where they were growing crops, their crops would be flooded, their fruit would be plucked. If they, as he says, one example he gives, which is a very powerful and interesting one, when we think about Dalit history, he describes someone returning from Natal, from South Africa, having been presumably a plantation laborer, and then come back with a bit of savings and being completely prevented from having any access to land by all these shenanigans that you can do basically with the rules. So we all know about, people taking land in other people's names, putting the patta in someone else's name. But one of the things they would do is there were rules at the time about who would be first offered any land that was for sale in the village.
Right.
That's a sort of Persian term that was used in administration. So it's rules of preference for who gets to buy land in the village. And the first right of refusal went to Mirasidars. And you can imagine that there would always be one of them who'd be willing to take that land rather than let it go to one of the laborers. So for practical purposes, as Tremenheer said, this is as he called it, this is slavery. And this was completely refuted. And honestly, as I say in the book, if I didn't have the missionary records to go by, I would have thought, oh, well, maybe this is just a weird anomaly. Maybe this guy was just exaggerating, or who knows? But, it's not corroborated that much anywhere else. Yeah. When you go to the mission archive, then you see, yes, this was happening everywhere. He's absolutely right. What he's describing is, ubiquitous across the villages of Tamil Nadu.
Absolutely. And the interesting part is when Tremenheer's note happens, and then there's the usual way the administration finagles around it, puts it to sleep, but then comes a moment where the missionary becomes the intercessor or interlocutor on behalf of that. Really, and now they in turn apply to the government saying, give us the land, and then they want to do pariah settlements. And in a very telling manner, now suddenly the upper castes, right, start objecting, saying, oh, wait, that pariah settlement will be near my temple. And actually, some of their petitions are practically threatening. Oh, well, you will put up a church there. It's okay. But by the way, we will go by banging drums and it may offend you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? And
it's this kind of, it's like
the unsaid threat hanging in the back, right?
Yeah.
You think yourself too smart and you're powerful and all, but we have our ways of. But here is where I do see that the colonial regime, which liked to think of itself as respecting the spirit of the law or the law of the land, which is why any time the upper castes dangle you're interfering with the religious neutrality, the government goes on the defensive to answer. And it goes to great lengths to establish that these missionaries are not converting pariahs. Rather, they are speaking on behalf of pariahs who had converted already. And their activities will be circumscribed only for the pariah Christians, not touching the Hindu Dalits.
Right. So they're different things, right? So sometimes, so basically what you're talking about is a period, starting around, say, like 1910, where for the first time, so we kind of missed this part, but once all these this massive influx of Pariah converts into the church, this became, it brought the Pariah problem, in a sense, to missionary consciousness. And what did they do with it? These were missionaries who happened to have very good relations with the state and were also kind of local notables, like and Adam Andrew was on the Taluk board of Chengalpattu, and they had prominent public.
He was in fact called Pariah Andrew.
Yes, and he was denounced as that by by his detractors. Yeah, and so once these sorry, I just got totally.
The missionaries who intercede on behalf of the pariah land requests, right? They in turn want the lands to be assigned to the missions. And before anyone starts having fancy notions of Indian church accumulating thousands of acres, that's not true. The maximum was 2,000 acres or so is what you put across.
Yeah.
So it's not really that much. And they in turn parcel out the lands to Dalits, where they still don't expect the Dalits to become full land owners,
right,
which is part of the thing. Essentially, still, even in the missionary perspective, Dalits are not seen as fit enough to be land owners.
No.
And
no. So this is part of the thing that I feel that it's, important to bring out. However much good the missionaries did, they had their limits in their vision. And one of them was imagining that, even William Gowdy, I can't tell you what a compassionate person he was, but even he says, that these people are only fit for being servants. Yeah. He says it,
He's the guy who goes and analyzes the shit.
Yes, he's so dedicated to this mission and to specifically Pariah conversion. He's you couldn't have someone who gave of themselves more selflessly, and even this person really didn't think that it was possible for a Pariah convert to become an independent landholder. He felt that was a foolish idea to try to push. And, so, as I say, and maybe, it seems harsh, but it's not, it's a totally different regime, but they're still subordinated and still expected to comply with certain kinds of rules in order to keep their land.
Absolutely. And one thing that I find, and we have discussed this before too, right? You try to strike a balance between the notion that the missionaries were filled with kindness versus when you want to balance that notion, you bring to light how even in their view, Dalits were not qualified to be completely independent agents. And they drew lines as to how far they would accommodate Dalit liberty or spirit for egalitarianism. So the missionaries had limits on their relationship with Dalits. So you want to balance out the notion that missionaries were angels. I'm putting it rather crudely here.
No.
But on the other hand, you also ensure that you don't go too far. And I see this tension sort of in a couple of the chapters where you don't want the reader to go away thinking that the missionaries were no better than the Mirasdars either.
No, definitely not. Definitely not, right? So they were, but the important thing is they were also caught, this is also something that I try to say. Yes, they were moved, but let's also understand sort of the timing of how this happened. When did they start getting involved in mass conversions? So obviously it's not that Dalits were not suffering before 1890, right? Why at this moment? And I think you have to, as a historian, you have to look and ask these questions. And there was an answer that I found, which was that the mission societies that were funding missionaries to come to India were suffering because Indians were not converting.
Yeah.
And, they depended on the congregations at home, and the congregations at home obviously found it much more appealing to fund the things that were working, right? You wouldn't throw your money into a losing project. And, Hinduism, the Hindus were notoriously impervious to the Christian message. So they simply Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, and about the lands or the perception of Dalits not being able to hold their, because everyone thought, oh, well, they'll barter it away, they'll drink it away, they will throw it away, right? Whereas, like when they were given lands, and Atkinson, colonial administrator, makes a note of the 669 plots that were given to Dalits, right? Only 70 were sold or remortgaged. That's almost just 10% perhaps.
Right. Which is way less than what you would be led to believe, right?
Which is way less than what we would. And your book also specifically talks about Panchamas from the Tanjore area who go to great lengths to acquire land even against their economic interest. In other words, let me be very clear on this. People will make bad economic choices against their economic interest, right? Like, for example, paying for something profligate, that's different. But here they're doing something against their economic interest to serve their human dignity.
Yes.
So the fact that some of them might have gone against their economic interest is not an argument to be seen in the usual conservative economist sense, where people often talk about, oh, somebody's acting against his economic interest, that's bad. But here it serves a higher purpose of personal individual dignity.
And it also, I think, demonstrates the brutality of the regime. If people are so desperate to get out, it's probably for a good reason, right? That's what we can. So just to, in case the audience doesn't know what we're talking about, so in Thanjavur, which is, notorious for its, for the strictness of its caste practices, so both the colonial state and the missionaries had sort of convinced themselves that Dalits were sort of benighted and needed people to kind of persuade them to do things in their own interest. And so, they started this scheme. The main thing, as we were talking about before, one of the biggest kind of tools of domination was the fact that Mirasidars, the landlords, owned the house sites where they lived. So in Thanjavur, at a certain point, the colonial state said, okay, we've got to sort of rationalize this landholding system. We've got to get them to start, at least owning their own house site. We can see that that's, not a modern economic system. And actually, this was the way they sold it to the Mirasidars, which was quite clever. They said, if we give them the house sites, they'll be even less likely to run away. And so that they started this scheme, and they were convinced. It's really quite funny when you read the archive. They were convinced, all these sort of men sitting around, the bureaucrats saying, oh dear, well, we're going to have to push them to do this. It's going to be such a slog. They're not going to understand. The minute the possibility of getting the house site in their own name was raised, they were flooded with applications, flooded with people demanding to do this, even so. And the point you were talking about against their economic interests. So there are cases where Mirasidas were saying, I will fire you. You can no longer work here if you get your own house site. And they were still doing it.
Yes.
That means that the degree of brutality they were facing was enough to make this chance of escape so appealing.
And I see it even more as in the quest for dignity
exactly.
and esteem. A person thinks no price is too high a price than my own dignity. Because which is what I was reading through Thirumavalavan's book on the Meenakshipuram conversion. It's an okay book. At least the original voices that he brings out is the real value of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Where people talk about what have they gained by converting to Islam, right? People who, like he'll say, a 10-year-old boy will call me a pariah and a name and ask me to get up from a bus seat. Whereas today, as a Muslim, I have that right. And when they asked about losing reservation privileges, right, the affirmative action privileges, it doesn't matter. I have earned my dignity. So they were ready to give up some of and this is the fact, right? When people speak about conversions as, oh, well, they sold themselves out, they got this, people lose governmental privileges.
Yes, and they do it anyway. What
And
does
they
that
do it
tell
anyway.
us, right? That should tell us something. The fact that so we think of the allurement as someone coming from outside and pulling Hindus away. But there's actually allurement in the state in the sense that the state gives you an incentive to stay a Hindu. So what I'm talking about is the fact that reservation, which is, India's sort of like affirmative action, and also most importantly, the laws that are supposed to, they don't hardly work at all, but in any case they exist. The laws that are supposed to protect Dalits from violence
are all for Hindu Dalits.
Only apply to Hindus. They apply to those called scheduled caste, which is defined by religion as a result of the fact, as I talk about, that in this period, the idea that the main thing that you had to know about Dalits was that it was a degraded group among the Hindus.
And shifting a little bit, right? So when the Panchamas were given homes, there were oppositions. Particularly by this time, because this happens around 1916, 1919, by which time there is a legislative council and all. There is one Sivasami Iyer who makes this goes against customs and stuff. And here's the irony. His father studied in a missionary school in Tanjore.
Oh, really?
This is a pet theory of mine, and I've actually tested this out. Anyone aged over 40 or 50 in the Hindutva circle and all, most often they would have gone through some Christian school. At this point, I would even jokingly say, I'll underline the word jokingly, that probably Christian institutions have produced more Hindutva than any other Hindu organization.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're right, because
including some well-known people, riffraff today. But Sivasami Iyer makes that point about Pariah power, and he's the one who makes the exception that saying, "Oh, don't make this noise about Pariah poverty. Poverty is for laborers, and laborers are in any country, any society, bound to be poor. This is not about their caste.
Right.
This is Sivasami Iyer.
Yeah.
Right? But before we jump to the usual narrative about Brahmins, we also see a guy like Munsif Krishna Iyer. District Munsif Krishna Iyer, on the other hand, in one of the judgments, he specifically cites Arthur Young's quote about how property can transform, the magic of property.
Yes.
All right. And I was reminded of this modern day economist, Hernando de Soto. He will talk about how property and land is important and the ability to transfer, sell, mortgage, that unleashes an economic. Somebody else was asking this question. So this, again, is that's what I love about these discussions. Like this friend here posted saying, the Land Reform Act froze the land value, and many of them could not unlock the land value. So sometimes it's all complex, right? Probably if you looked at that act, somebody must have had a different notion, but it came out differently and affected differently, right? So there is this Munsif Krishna Iyer, probably the first, one of the key persons that you cite in the welfareism that has now come about. Because he calls forth the government to say that the Pariah problem is a social problem that the government should address. So while there is a Sivasami Iyer, there is another Krishna Iyer on the other end of the spectrum.
Yes. Well, that illustrates an obvious but sometimes forgotten point that, there's diversity among any caste.
Exactly.
There isn't a problem.
Obviously, I want to underscore this point because we are talking about Tamil Nadu and the Dravidian movement, which we will get into a little forth, right? So, and these things that you speak about is also because by this time, 1919, 1918, here's the other question that come in, and I'll use this as a segue. They say, what role did the missionaries play in the political awareness of Dalits given their social exclusion? Right? your point, I can already see you raring to go at it. It's the missionaries didn't encourage the political awareness, if I read your book correctly, right? So it happens because by 1918, the one of the magazines that, in fact, you had provided to Balasubramaniam Jayapal, Varikattuvan, some issues of Varikattuvan, which then he reprinted recently,
Yeah.
right? 1918, there is a federation they promote, and there are articles in Varikattuvan about the meetings in Tanjore area where the Mirasdars discuss, hey, the government is trying to give them land. How do we oppose this? All this is being discussed and reported in a Dalit-run magazine.
It's
By
amazing.
this time, and I want viewers here to go there. We did an earlier session, a brilliant session with Balasubramaniam Jayapal and V. Ratnamala on Dalit journalism. Ayodhya Das was a journalist. Rettamala Srinivasan was a journalist. There is a rich tradition of Dalit journalism that will surprise a lot of people. Much before even Gandhi spoke about drinking as a problem or prohibition, Dalit journals have spoken about it.
Yeah.
There was a Dalit journal devoted to temperance. There was an English one and a Tamil one. The English one was called Temperance Herald, and there was a Tamil one called Madhuvilakku Thudan.
Yeah.
Right, all this happened. So again, you can expand on this, right? The political awareness was already happening amongst the educated Dalits and the Dalit leadership, and the diarchy that was coming into place was
Yeah.
giving a space to L.C. Gurusamy, Rettamala Srinivasan, and there was
Veerayan,
yes, Veerayan. Thank you.
Raja.
MC Raja, all of them. Incidentally, Balasubramaniam Jayapal recently delivered a wonderful lecture on L.C. Gurusamy.
Oh, wow.
And his contributions. But take away that question and explain to us, because this is one of the key themes of your book.
Yeah.
That Dalits were not a voiceless, mindless minority.
Yes.
Right? There is the nameless and faceless people who still stand up for their rights, their dignity, the farmers in Tanjore asking for lands. And in fact, many of them give witnesses to the government about when the Mirasdars pretend that they are treating them with paternalistic care. These nameless and faceless people at great risk witness that, no, we are oppressed, we are being treated harshly. So they are the ones who give the real reports. Then comes the Dalit leadership and their function in the assembly. Would you like to expand on this one? And I don't think the missionaries really encouraged. They did play some part, as you say, in the early on, right? But later on, the Dalits took the torch themselves.
Yeah, I mean, of course, they were enabled by education, often in missionary institutions. So to that extent, yes. But I guess what's just astonishing to me, what is so impressive, is the degree of political sharpness and critique that is just unmatched by. It couldn't have come from missionaries. It's not reproduced in any other missionary sources. These were ideas coming from Dalits who were very closely still linked to the agrarian economy and understood what was happening to them, not surprisingly. It's more, I think it says more about the audiences and the way our society is, that people have even accepted that there are any people who are literally voiceless. People can understand when they're being exploited.
This is once the Dalit leadership in the assembly, right? I call it legislative council or legislative assembly. Sorry, I don't know what the exact
it was council back then. Yeah,
back then, right? For the first time, they start talking citizenship rights and public spaces. I'm reminded of the foreword that Nirad Chaudhary had in his book, the sequel to Autobiography of an Unknown Indian, I think, Thy Hand Great Anarch. Civis Britannicus Sum, right? So he'll say, I was throwing a challenge to the colonial regime. I am a citizen of Britain and I have rights, which is how the national movement actually starts. saying, why do you discriminate against us? We are citizens of the empire, right? And now that citizenship bestows rights beyond caste, class, or any other factor was being made by the Dalits.
I mean, basically, I see it as so powerful because I discovered in the archive that even though there was this category, administrative category, public land, public this, it was tacitly known and accepted that no Dalits could ever have access to it. So basically what MC Raja is doing is saying, wait a second, you can't call something public and not let us use it. We are also citizens, and he even says we are also taxpayers. Some of them are at this point. But yes, exactly. So he kind of calls out the implicit exclusion that the term public was making before. And he's saying, no, if you're going to have public paths, if you're going to have public roads, if these are going to be made with taxpayer money, we can use them too. And it was a violent battle for virtually every single thing, right? So we know the thing you I think you mentioned but Meenakshipuram. How did it start? It started because they wouldn't allow people to sit on a bus. They wouldn't allow Dalits to sit on a bus.
Amongst many other things, yeah.
Amongst many other things. But I'm saying, that this was happening also in 1925, as it, like this.
And there's actually one more parallel, right, coming to the public thing, right? So, like Kalpati, I believe that is the point that Veerayan makes, right? So where they want to take, the Eravas want to take a procession, and they're prevented by the upper caste, and there's violence, but the police register a case and arrest only the Eravas.
Yes.
If I'm quoting from memory. In Meenakshipuram, a similar exact thing happens. So there is a religious festival by the Dalits, and now the Devas come and crash it, and there is a clash, and now the police happily arrests several from here and a few from there. It's almost like, oh, both of you created trouble.
Right. Which the implicit thing is you're not really allowed in public, right? That's what the state is saying.
So
it's basically saying, no, you're not allowed.
To say across 100 years, little changed.
Yeah, no, it is amazing, and this was the kind what was. So in terms of people I really learned from, MC Raja is one of them. I feel like his analysis of the state was so sharp and sophisticated. I've never read anything like it.
He does speak at a Catholic meeting in Tanjavur, where they talk about caste issues. And by then he was a minister. I don't know his exact portfolio, but he does come and speak there, and then he speaks about caste and stuff. So MC, again, there is so much of intellectual churning that happens. And pretty much by the 1930s, and this is what will take us probably to the concluding part, right? By the 1930s, the missionaries, while they still run schools and hospitals, whatnot, colonial regime is still there. But then they are receding to the background. And Dalit leadership and the Gandhian movement come to the forefront, which is where the definition of Dalits as Hindus begins.
Right. It begins, but it's already begun in Tamil Nadu.
Yes. Yeah.
So it becomes a national issue, a national anxiety, a source of national anxiety.
The politics of numbers, Webster calls it the politics of numbers, because by now, I'll just make this point and then you can take it back.
No,
right?
please.
I have often found this to be surprising. With no reason whatsoever, with no reason for optimism, so many sections of India thought at some point India is going to be free. We are going to be running the government. But who will run the government? Who will the government be for? By and large, people thought it will be dominated by Hindus, number one, and number two, it will be dominated by upper caste. And this goes like 50 years before the independence, when
Right.
such an optimism is actually totally unwarranted. Because at that point, even Congress or Gandhi, who will become the national leader, is not yet asking for complete independence. But even back then, people somehow figured, I mean, this is what struck me most, whether it was Ambedkar, Jinnah, Periyar, so many, so on and so forth, and so many others. Everyone is somehow making their then politics, keeping in mind what a free India may be, and letting that dictate, oh my God, I don't want to live in a Hindu dominated India. I don't want to live in a Brahmin dominated India. And this is how the politics gets shaped up. And this is where the identity of the Dalit also becomes a huge issue, because with all the uprisings happening, here is this large set of people. MC Raja does not want them to represent all Dalits, because many of them are Dalit Christians. And now he wants Dalit Christians to be included as Christians, not as Dalits. Because that will mean, this is a point that Webster brings out. Because if Dalit Christians were treated as Dalits, it is possible that the government could nominate a Dalit Christian as a Dalit representative and become the voice in the assembly legislative process. Now, that is anathema to MC Raja.
Very hard to understand.
Labyrinthine in such a manner, but anyway, yeah. So that is where the definition of Dalits as Hindus, and today that, and still again, conversion, right?
Yeah.
If we are assuming they're Hindus, if we are accepting that they're, and which is where you had a few points to talk about the identity.
Yeah. So, ultimately, who has the authority to determine whether people are of the same religion or not? It's the state. And so, as there came to be these rumblings, as you're saying, about sort of independence or, political devolution, there was going to be some role for Indians in politics. That was known. And, this was very exciting for lots of people. So what should, how should Dalits respond to this? One of the things to remember is that in the colonial period, one of the things that we should think about when we read what they said and how bold and interesting they were is to recognize that they were selected, right? They were chosen. They didn't have to appeal to voters when they were in the council. So I think this is a really critical point. But yes, the point that you're making is that suddenly, once you have the possibility of elections, numbers matter in a new way. And this is indeed why, if you think about what groups have risen up in any way in India, in Indian society, it's the most numerous often.
Yeah.
In different states, right? That's who the political machine backs, because that will bring the winning election. So you have this sudden. As I often tell people, there's nothing more ironic than the idea of assuming that the default religion of Dalits is Hindu, and then they're getting converted to something else. Because there's no basis in any sort of in science, right? There's no basis in academic or in any kind of empirical information where you could say, yes, these people belong to the same religion. And in fact, it was denied before this explicitly. It's only when it became a matter of having a majority political constituency, right? That suddenly we were told, oh, no, Dalits have been Hindus. They've always been Hindus. We're all part of the same thing. So.
Absolutely. And so here's an interesting question that came up, and we'll spend some time on this and then take to the next one. The caste state nexus, right? So yes, and to answer to you, Geeta, right, we have jumped a few topics here. I was trying to give a flavor, and because we spent a little too much time on some topics,
Yeah.
something does get obscured. So if you want to give a brief response to the caste and state next, and somebody else also raised this point earlier, saying that because the British colonial government needed money,
Yeah.
tax revenue, and they wanted have these mirasdars as the channels, because they didn't want, like we say in modern day management parlance, right? I want one collar to catch if the project didn't finish. So like that, they didn't want to have tax revenue being dependent on n number of actors. It is easy to have, I need revenue from 10 people and you 10 manage 10,000 acres or something like that. So the caste to state nexus, if you could dilate on that, then we'll come back to the modern era and round up a little bit.
Yeah, it is a really important point, because it goes back to some of the things that I already said. But basically, when you look at the way the state operates in terms of its policies regarding landholding, and you look at where, so it's a common technique for historians to look at sort of conflicts and see what they show. And what you find is that systematically the colonial state is making decisions that seem to go against its own official policies, but are in the interests of landlords. And every time there is any kind of conflict, so my book traces a lot of different minor conflicts in different villages. And in every case, you see that, so even in the cases where they do grant land to Dalits or whatever, there's a very careful protection of rights that are technically not supposed to exist in colonial rule, right? So it's supposed to be the case that Mirasi, that public lands are owned by the government. But in practice, they would always let Mirasidas make claims to them because they didn't want to deal with the repercussions of court or whatever could happen. So to make things, as you said, you need the one collar. It was a question of efficiency. It was a question of economy in the sense of both fiscal and efficient, right? You had to keep it economic. And this is exactly why it was necessary. And it's also something that shouldn't, it shouldn't even come as a surprise, because we can see similar processes with states all over the world. States have relationships with different kinds of economic elites. And
also, right, the perception of Dalits, right? So naturally, and this I will also answer in a slightly different manner, right? I often say that the apogee of the Brahminical hegemony was during the colonial power. This is a point that many researchers have made about how the colonial government,
yeah,
inadvertently or whatever, right? For instance, when they want to frame laws, they go to Brahmins, because Brahmins were reputed to be the elite of creme de la creme of the Hindu society. And therefore, the Brahmins are repeatedly approached by the colonial regime to know, how do I govern your society?
Yeah.
Which is how Bhagavad Gita becomes such a big central piece of the colonial regime, and the Shastras become such a central piece. In other words, probably the Brahmins have never had it so good in any regime as they did during the colonial regime, which tightens the caste state nexus, to which that the Brahmin Kshatriya nexus didn't even exist to that level.
I mean, I think that my understanding of so I would say that it's absolutely right. You're absolutely right that there was a totally new relationship between, so first of all, what happened in the colonial period to Brahmins specifically is that many of them diversified, right? Many of them started investing, they were among the first to invest precisely in missionary education, and then use the advantages of this training to become officers of the state. So this was where their kind of incredible visibility comes from, right? In the Madras context, is that they were excessively disproportionately represented in the state.
Yeah.
And in the capital, therefore. And so, in a sense, though, it's a very interesting thing, because it's it demonstrates their kind of exit from landholding as a prominent form of,
the escape velocity is just stunning.
It's stunning. And then you see, you Brahmins are obviously not suffering in Tamil Nadu today, and they're not in the government so much, but they have, I don't know if you've read Chris Fuller's
Yes.
book.
Yeah.
But his work on Tamil Brahmins, it's very interesting. They've diversified, and they've gotten out, they've found new niches to
Absolutely
dominate in.
There's an interesting and a repetitive question, but before we go to that, can you briefly address your current research interest and talk to something about the Dravidian movement in Tamil Nadu?
Okay. Well, first of all, I should say that I take research very seriously. I haven't finished the research for this book. So these are all opinions in progress. What I think is really critical, as I mentioned earlier, right, is that there's a major social division. It's also a political economic division between Dalits and everyone else. If you take the side of the most oppressed, then you say that a progressive politics needs to address that cleavage in some way. Right now, the first kind of emergence of Dravidianism is in the 1920s with or the teens rather, with the Justice Party, and it's interesting because I think a lot of people don't know this, although it's very widely available. If you look at this statement, which the Justice Party first releases, called the Non-Brahmin Manifesto, right? What is their claim? Are they saying we are oppressed, and therefore we should, be given rights because we're not Brahmins and we're being oppressed by Brahmins? Actually, it doesn't say that. It says we are the dominant people and the Brahmins are acting like they're the only dominant ones. We want our rightful place back. We are already the leaders of society. That's a very different claim than we are all victims of oppression.
Absolutely.
So
it frames their policy responses, and it is beyond the purview of this discussion, but this is precisely where another discussion with a friend pointed out. He said, Aravindan, why do you think Periyar always spoke of Ambedkar more than, or possibly Periyar, I don't even know how many times Periyar has spoken about the local leadership, MC Raja, Rettamala Srinivasan, and others, whereas he speaks of Ambedkar more, because the local leaders were at loggerheads with the Dravidian movement. They do collaborate at sometimes, and then they're also at loggerheads. Then comes the watershed Binni Mill strike, which tears asunder the ties of the Dalits with the justice movement. And let me also add again, this is going to be beyond the purview of the program or the topic, so we will not spend too much time. And the way I see the trajectory, because 1920 or 21 Binni Mill strike happens. It's a huge watershed moment. And then the riots, Puliyandopu riots happen. And then the Dalits part ways with the Justicites. Precisely at that moment, the Gandhian movement takes root in Tamil Nadu, which is a more broad-based. We can criticize the Gandhian movement, and fairly enough so, but that is when the Dalits start migrating a little bit more towards the Gandhian movement. And there also someone like Sahajanandar collaborates, competes, criticizes. So it's never a uniform relationship. It cannot be.
Exactly. It cannot be.
Even MC Raja's relationship with Ambedkar is a rocky one.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And I look at all of this as disagreement and a mutual conflict is also a sign of intellectual activity.
Yes.
That everyone just didn't fall in line is actually a sign of mature intellectual activity within the community. And this is often lost sight of. And particularly Raja and Ambedkar's conflicts are very interesting to study in the background of the Munjay Pact.
Mm-hmm.
Ambedkar's Munjay Pact, so on and so forth. But in the interest of time, and then maybe we could take some more questions. Two friends of mine, and we had talked about this question. Two of my good friends had raised this question. I really wanted to know what made Rupa take up this topic, right? So to Chitra and to Ganesh Venkatraman also asked this question: what motivated her to do research on this, right? So before you answer, right? So to both of you, Ganesh and Chitra, we had talked about this, right? So one of the criticisms today from the Dalit intellectual circles, Suraj Engade has been very specific about this. The domination of Savarnas in the Dalit sociology study space, right? And so can you answer what motivated you to do the research, and in turn also answer Suraj Engade's question?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of what interested me, I guess, as I said, I don't think there's anything particularly unusual about my upbringing. I am a Brahmin. I grew up outside of India and had very little contact with, ideas of caste, except definitely as a kind of, there was a background noise, you could say, where, it was generally accepted that it was not such a bad thing, but it was not really, this is, of course, a sign of privilege. It was not really something we had to think about, and we were outside of India. Then when I started university at Columbia, New York. And as I learned more about India, my curiosity and also sense of just disgust, or sort of this, so one thing, if you're lucky enough to be well educated, it should hopefully instill in you a feeling that you shouldn't be deceived, right? That you shouldn't be lied to in some way. And it was really the topic of, I started getting interested in this issue of rice Christians because I had studied religion, and the whole way that people thought it was okay to talk about the motives of the poor. It seemed so wrong. And I started looking at these things, reading more around it. And just as I said, it was really just the degree of falsehood and bad faith that I kept finding over and over again. I didn't know what would come out of this research, right? But I got more and more invested in it because it seemed like there was a huge cover-up, basically. So there it is. Of course, that in terms of who else influenced me, I obviously learned so much from all the Dalit intellectuals that I have met in Tamil Nadu over the last 20 years now. Dayanandan, Paul Dayanandan, who you mentioned, who is a professor at MCC, P. Sivakami, Ravi Kumar, and then of course a younger generation of historians now who are doing probably the most exciting, I feel like if there's one hope on the horizon, it's the fact that there is this incredible Dalit writing and intellectual ferment happening in Tamil Nadu today.
I'll just add to that point, right? So Stalin Rajangam, Balasubramaniam Jayapal, Ko Raghupati.
Yes.
I have my own disagreements with some of their writing, but then the scholarship is stellar.
Yeah, absolutely.
Scholarship that's coming out. And I'm sorry if I have missed out a few other names. These are the names that came.
This is why I was hesitant to name anyone, because there are so many people to name.
Like
but
Raghupati's book on Dalitum Tannirum will show up to the 80s how Dalits or Dalit areas did not get public wells. It is the exclusion is stunningly systemic.
Yeah. Can I just
recently, and I'm sorry,
yeah,
like wonderful books on MC Raja's speeches and writings. edited by Gautama Sanna. And then there is another wonderful documentary, document-based book on Rettamala Srinivasan, also by Sanna. These are, the MC Raja book was by V. Alex, sorry.
Yes.
By Neelam Publication. And again, that's another thing, the emergence of Neelam Publications. And then there is Bodhi, that's run by Ravi Kumar. The intellectual ferment within the Dalit circles today is just stunning on a scale that's not yet fully appreciated by many.
Yeah, and it's so exciting, and there's so many interesting, every time a new issue of one of these magazines comes out, every single article is, it's a really exciting moment in Tamil Nadu.
My friend had this question because he comes from a physics background. Okay. So he asked, how come the shift from mathematics to social sciences happened?
So, this is probably where my caste background is most relevant. Just like lots of people, or not even caste, also class, right? I was.
You came to Columbia, right? You came to Columbia University.
I came to Columbia University, and I was very lucky. I'm an American citizen. So I could get access to certain kinds of fellowships, based on citizenship, but I got a scholarship to do math. And so then I was sort of stuck with it. But, it was really just a matter of what I had ended up doing in high school and not really knowing what I wanted to do. And thank goodness I ended up at a university where, in the US, where I was forced to study a lot more than just math in order to get the degree. And then by the end, I was quite sure that I wouldn't be staying with math.
And we are thankful for that. One more thing, sometimes these discussions are interesting. So I wanted to, it's kind of going back, my apologies, but Geeta, I didn't misunderstand your question. Yes, because I took the question and went with it in a different direction. So yes, Rupa's book is more about, when she talks about the caste state nexus, it's more about the non-Brahmin landholding caste.
I wouldn't say it's more. I mean, it's about all landholders. They were Brahmins, they were non-Brahmins, and this is the other thing, about the Justice Party or whatever. Like, yes, you can find conflict between Brahmins and non-Brahmins, of course, in the archive. But when it came to issues about Dalit, there was just absolute agreement. How can you not reflect that in politics? Like, how is that something that you can ignore when you're trying to form a political movement?
Like Rangacharya.
Yeah.
Rangacharya, who cites a breach of peace. And another one advising Dalits, go get yourself converted.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Right,
no,
so
but also, there's a part where I think actually this isn't even in the book, but there's a moment where when these schemes are being enacted, some of the house site schemes, one of the collectors says to the higher ups, a British collector says to one of the higher ups, his name was Vernon, if I remember, he says, be careful, because the non-Brahmins are starting to get
you bring out this point.
They're the ones who are supporting us right now. We've got to get Congress away from this. So, don't upset the apple cart. We need these people.
Absolutely. What you say is that because at that time, the non-Brahmin movement was very pro-colonial regime. And again, this goes back to saying that anything that is not colonial or a free India will be a Brahminical regime.
Right.
So the non-Brahmin movement in Tamil Nadu stayed away from what you would call the quote-unquote nationalist aspiration.
Anti-colonial nationalist.
And therefore, the colonial government saw them more as partners, or at least a section of people who are not against them. And therefore, they felt giving lands to Panchamas might alienate the non-Brahmin landowners and in turn push them against the regime. Everything was a complex set of motives, like people moving on a chessboard. Everyone trying to guess what will happen if I gave this to Dalits?
Yeah.
Who is it going to antagonize? But the answer to that was always pretty much everyone who is not a Dalit gets antagonized.
And that kind of agreement, that you see, like when MC Raja starts demanding citizens' rights, no, everybody falls in line. Every single colonial official, every Indian Brahmin or non-Brahmin, they're all happy to say, no, you need to maintain law and order no matter what. And
Yeah.
the social and also they specifically get together to kind of use the religious neutrality argument again to say that this Pariah problem is something which is ours, right? It's a social problem, so you please keep out of it. We'll manage our own society and get it to move forward at the pace that is reasonable for it.
Yeah, and again, the ratio of holding, right? So while the ratio of holding was there, I will make this point, right? So obviously she's trying to argue that the Brahmin officers supported the landowners, but the ratio of holding was more non-Brahmins held the lands. But let's also not forget that Brahmins held very consequential positions in the colonial
administration. Yeah.
So by now, who held the land was becoming a little less important, but who could make policy was becoming more important also. So this is a complex relationship that was going on at that time. So I think we are almost towards the end. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about, Rupa, or anybody else with a question? I think the book opens up a lot of. I don't know if Parthiban wants to come online. He was. I see him there, but I don't know. Okay. Let me try to add him in, and if not, that's okay. Again, this is an interesting question that came up. Can you list the top 3 authors or writers that you think everyone should know? Like, what are the books about land, caste, the church history?
Wow. There's just so many.
Maybe don't don't limit yourself to top 3. But one thing I'll tell everyone before you answer, Rupa, okay?
Yeah.
Yesterday I was going through Dalit Consciousness, another book, Samuel Jayakumar, I think.
Oh yes, I know that book.
Okay. I was going through that book, and the book was actually written as a reaction to the Dalit liberation theology and the contestations by the Dalit liberation theology. Because now this might surprise a lot of people. Within the Dalit liberation theology school, now there's a lot of questioning of the church and what the missionaries did or didn't do. So this question, everything that Rupa is trying to set the balance for is happening on a different plane within the church itself. Dalit liberation theology is now questioning, what did the church do for us, really? I mean, really, that's the way they're asking. And that book was written by Samuel Jayakumar precisely as a rebuttal to the Dalit liberation theologians, saying like, we may not have gotten everything right, but here is all that we did, the church did. And as I was reading that, I was wondering, because I looked at the publication date, it was 15 years before yours. And has Rupa referred to this book? And bingo, you had referred to it. And then I thought, you have not left any stone unturned. This is a book I am happy to tell the viewers, prodigious research has gone in. Prodigious research. The amount of government archives, missionary archives, and you set the context for each of them. Probably the footnotes run to like 70, 80 pages. Some of them footnotes are not just footnotes. They are more like you expand a point. Because you couldn't say that in the flow of the page, right? So you bring it out as a footnote and you expand a little further on it. So that's the beauty of that book. This is a book to be really read and digested. And now if you want to cite some authors or something.
I mean, on the issue of Dalits and religion and conversion, my friend Joel Lee's new book, Deceptive Majority, on the history of Tamil Nadu and slavery, of course, land and caste. There's this wonderful article. It's just an article, but it's by Benedicta Hjellhje, called slavery in South India. I can't remember exactly what it's called. Thank you for listening, Mr. Ratnaraj. Oh gosh, there's so many. Haruka Yanagisawa's book, Land and Caste, is just fantastic. If you haven't read Burton Stein on medieval Tamil Nadu, it's just also fantastic and really lays the foundation for, a kind of the ways that Brahmins and Vellalas created a kind of ruling alliance in the medieval period. Gosh.
Dharma Kumar's, of course.
Yeah, no, Dharma Kumar I mentioned.
And C.J. Fuller's take on
the Tamil Brahmins. Oh, and then of course, the works that I like best on the Dravidian movement are by Marguerite Ross Barnett. Okay, she's a fascinating person. She was a Black woman who came to, I believe she's passed away, but she came to India and studied the Dravidian movement, and makes some claims that people have carefully just never talked about.
And just to segue on that one, if I may, right? So people often ask me, what are the books on the Dravidian movement? I often say Irschik.
Yes.
He takes it up to 1920.
It's really good.
And then C.J. Barnett, C.J. Baker, he takes it somewhere up to 1940, 50 something. And then Margaret Ross Barnett takes it up to the 70s. So Irschik, C.J. Baker, Margaret Ross Barnett, that's a trilogy, I would say, gives the arc from the justice movement to the days when MGR takes power.
Yes.
Pretty much with that, the Dravidian movement comes to an end at 77. The Dravidian movement as such, I would say, ended. After that, it's just two parties haggling for power. And it's just electoral politics after that. I wouldn't call it a movement after that.
Those are all such excellent books. And I would say that, you've just cited the three that are sort of conspicuously absent in a lot of discussions.
Oh, yeah. And the church history, the Frankenberg series, particularly Dennis Hudson's research on Protestant church, Arumuga Navalar, for example, has been written. If somebody wants to learn about Arumuga Navalar, you should go to a book on church history. There is rich, unbiased, fantastic information by Dennis Hudson and others on Arumuga Navalar, and practically the man was a single man army against conversions. Dennis Hudson makes this point. But for this man, how many hundreds would have been converted is a point he makes. So,
yeah, that's the one, Karthik.
Yeah, thanks, Karthik. That's wonderful. Because even I wouldn't have, I don't know this book, and obviously I would have gotten the last name.
Just an article, but it's a very long article, and it's just so comprehensive. I mean, as we were saying, the kind of, you talk to the average man on the street in Tamil Nadu, and he will tell you there's never been any slavery in Tamil Nadu. We don't have slaves, This kind of would put paid to that idea.
And there's a good question from a fellow German for you. It says, are there any universities like Gottingen where such studies, apparently he's talking about Dalit studies or land and slavery studies?
There are lots of really good, I think that, so another book that I should mention is a book which is very recent called, what's it called? But it's by Alpa Shah and Jens Lerche, and it's a collection of essays which is about the relationship of caste, class, and tribe in today's economy, in today's political economy, and how it's still, and this was a collective work. So there were a lot of different young researchers involved. If I can name one who I, Jayasilan Raj, who's written on Kerala, it's really excellent work. I guess I would say that there are universities. but if you're, it all depends on the kind of level of study you're at. So there are many places where, well, actually, I should say there aren't that many places that would be very happy with a project like
I think in the US, because of the Black Studies program, a lot of Dalit studies are now sprouting, I would say. Probably more in the American universities than probably in the European universities.
Yeah, I mean, but I guess I wouldn't see that as an unqualified good, because the way that these things work in universities, as you know, or you may not know, but there's a real danger of ghettoization, right? So you don't want everyone who works on Dalits to only talk to other people who work on Dalits, and you all kind of congratulate each other. You need to make it into the mainstream.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we have had a wide-ranging discussion, and I cannot say enough, right? So I'll say this: sometimes people have asked me the question, why did I get interested in this topic, right? So it started with your book, actually. So by and large, yes, I have been more on the Gandhian side, studying more about Gandhi and the history and stuff like that. But 2015, when your book came out, for some reason or the other, I came across it at that time and have been reading it in parts always. And then along the line, then last year were two wonderful events, one with Stalin Rajangam, who's doing admirable work,
Just amazing.
and ruffling quite a lot of feathers. He probably ruffles quite a lot of feathers today. And
it would be very hard to be in his position. I mean, I don't envy him, and I have such huge respect. And I have to say, so among the other, so you can meet so many people in Tamil Nadu who can direct you to these ways of looking at things. And Stalin is not only a wonderful scholar himself, but I had the opportunity to go with him to meet some of the older Dalit leaders, like X-Ray Manikyam, and then I got to know Yerimalai Ratnam, people whose lives are really amazing, just astonishing. But can I just want to address, I'm really sorry, but I feel like that question, about Dalit studies and are there too many Savarnas, yes, there are too many Savarnas everywhere to a certain extent, right? Because they historically, we all know why. So of course, anyone who's in academia ought to be doing their best to ensure that access is more equitable, and to work actively to change that that particular composition of academia. Yeah, just want to say that.
Absolutely. And
yeah.
My take is that anyone should be able to do any study as long as you bring integrity. Let's talk about sympathy, empathy, putting in their shoes. All follow that, but there should be an intellectual integrity to that, and questioning what's an established narrative, always based on well laid out facts or plausible theories, right? So those are the things, which is where I found your book to be very different from so many of the established narratives about missionaries, Dalits, and the colonial regime, the triad, so to speak. So you shine a different light, and that's why the book interested me a lot. And some of these things, particularly when I came to the US 23 years ago, 24 years ago, obviously I got interested in the history of the country, and naturally the Black history is a huge part of it. And Martin Luther King, of course, has a certain attraction because of the way he can speak and whatnot. And he's naturally an iconic figure. So let me also add, Parthiban, 1 minute. I'll just finish this point and then you can come on.
Okay. No problem. Continue.
Stay on. So the Dalit discussion, right? It is huge for me. right? And obviously, because my primary interest used to be Gandhi and colonial era, the freedom struggle, I cannot do that without an interest in the Dalit struggle. And some of what I learned last year stunned me beyond belief. Like Stalin Rajagam's book, right? One of his books makes this point about Ilaya Perumal. Ilaya Perumal is leading a protest saying, here are occupations that we will not do. In Tamil, it is called Iri Thoril Marupu Poratam. Right? Normally, I'm used to reading about a people saying, don't prohibit me from doing work, or don't prohibit me from this occupation. Whereas here, for the first time, probably, people are saying, don't make me do this. Right? So that inverts the whole thing on the head.
Yeah.
Such things I found very engaging and interesting. And then, in many sad ways, like yesterday, I finished reading Thirumavalavan's book on Meenakshi. Sometimes you just ask yourself, what has changed, if at all?
Yeah.
And that's a sad commentary.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
human perspective. It interests me, but without much ado, Parthiban, you want to go ahead and ask?
Yeah.
By the way, Parthiban has read your book.
Okay. Thank you for struggling through.
I think I say good afternoon, Rupa.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you.
Yeah. Just I'm halfway through your book, actually.
Okay.
My only question is just the way the book was written is, it is like a generalized term. You not maybe, I don't know, understood the caste discrimination in Tamil Nadu right from the days of colonial area.
Your question being, Parthiban, or I may let Rupa answer, or I have a different take on it. But go ahead, Rupa.
Okay, I will reframe it. Okay. See, as far as I read the book, the discussion, okay, it's a different thing. As far as I read this book, actually, what is the Rupa has studied only on the Protestant missionaries. Am I correct? Okay. If you see the percentage of what do you call Christianity in Tamil Nadu, especially, the percentage of difference between the Protestants and Roman Catholic is little bit. It's not as you mentioned in this book, actually. And second thing, as AK already mentioned, that Roman Catholic were most concerned about the converting the higher caste people. Only Protestants have come to the point area of I don't say it is a conversion. I can say it as a upliftment of pariahs, actually. Yes, as you said in your book, actually. Of course, I don't want to use that word, actually. Sorry. I don't want to use that word, actually, but okay. With your context of the book, you...
So is there, can you frame the question really, Parthiban? I think both Rupa and I are struggling to find. Is there a question that you want to pose?
So he's saying, like, the first point is that there are significant numbers of Roman Catholics.
Yeah, Roman Catholics. Yeah. That was not spoken in your book, actually.
Right. It wasn't. You're right.
Of course, in the introductory chapter itself, you explained that you are going through only the Protestants.
Yeah.
But if you go by, we will take it as a Tamil Nadu, of course. You are talking about the colonial area, which is the Madras province has its hold on almost 4 southern states of southern states of India. But you specifically confined yourself to the mostly northern state of Tamil Nadu.
Right. So the reason is because those. So as I was saying it a little bit to Aravindan before, it's only because those missionaries were the ones that were closely involved with the state and then helped to literally form these policies, which then went on to affect the whole, to affect everyone. In fact, they were, most of these, depressed classes policies were exactly used as models for other states. The Tamil Nadu government was the first, the Madras government was the first to have a Department of Labor, which was actually a department of depressed classes welfare. That's a different story. But yeah, so Madras was the laboratory for how to govern Dalits, in my view. But yes, you're right. There's a whole different story to be told about Dalit activism, etc., from the Roman Catholic Church, and it's very, very important. And David Moss talks about it. Karthik Damodaran, who was recently just here, he has work on this based on his studies of caste relations in southern Tamil Nadu. So there's a lot of it is very important. I completely agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Parthiban. And
that was the question.
Yeah. Here is a different, I don't know if he's done with that. One minute. Hey, Parthiban, are you done? Is there anything else that you want to ask?
Yeah. The other thing is, actually, I have a slight feeling that what Rupa speaking about this Protestant missionaries, they are going behind the lands than they educating the people. Actually, that Protestant missionaries' main prime is, as Rupa written in his book, actually, it is to educate the people and spiritualize and introspect their belief on these things.
Mm-hmm.
But again and again, when I go through this book, till I read, actually, it was, even she mentioned that going behind the, what do you call this, Porumboka or communal or public lands, no?
Yeah.
It was disputed on a religious line only.
Yes.
Yeah. So that what I'm saying is that the landed caste people recognized. Yeah. So the colonial state, by saying we won't interfere in religion, gave elite people some opportunity, right, to figure out how to protect their privileges. They could just say that they were religious, and in many ways, actually, this is something the modern state in India does too. We have these, you can't hurt religious sentiments. Whose sentiments are always getting hurt? It's always the powerful, right? Mm-hmm. So basically, what they're doing is threatening a law and order problem if people don't shut up.
Okay. You are also written about this new liberalism happened in India, has made a change in colonial area in India. That is how Reverend Father Shara Caste, of course, he lost 2-3 cases, but in spite of all those things, he won the case in Jayangonda Solapuram.
Yes.
Am I correct, madam?
Yes, absolutely. So he got this land, yeah.
Yeah, he got this land actually.
Yes.
So Treman is actually, we are talking about lot of things about we talk a lot of things about this Treman is recommendations actually. Mm-hmm. Only after 6 years it was came into what do you call in existence in the colonial area.
Yes.
So based on the Treman Heer's recommendation only, all these changes has happened actually.
Treman Heer presents the report in 1891, but then there are other forces that come into play, and around 1898, the land grants start happening.
No.
It's not directly a consequence of Treman Heer's report.
No, okay. After 19, I think, as Rupa has written, it is in 1906, I think, Dr. Sharakas got this Jayangonda Solapuram verdict.
Yes.
As she also meant, only after 10 years report, after 6 years, it has come to in practical things. And of course, one Mr. Penny, the Reverend Penny has played a major role in this thing.
Yes.
Hey, Parthiban, we got another few questions to be asked.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's okay.
Thanks.
I'll withdraw. Thanks.
Hey, there was this interesting question, but I don't know if you want to take this on, but it's about Sri Lanka because I do see some reference in your book on this, which is why I thought I'll still pose it. But if you feel, hey, it's out of the purview, that's
I do feel it's out of my purview.
okay. All right. So let's just leave it at that. And absent any other questions, but it's been a great session, Rupa.
Thank you
Like I said,
so
it
much for
opens-
your, I'm so lucky to have a reader like you. Believe me, I don't get many such readers. So thank you so much for all these questions and for hopefully, we've communicated some of these ideas to people. So I invite anyone who's interested, read there. We just talked about all these books. There are just a huge number of things to read out there, and hopefully you too will be.
It's an absolutely fantastic book that everyone should give a shot. Like I said, it helps you explain what's going on today, and it'll help you understand, particularly a very potent area that is so controversial today. And the only thing that I leave the viewers with is when you speak of people who are oppressed, speak of it with compassion and try to learn first, try to have an understanding of their motivations before you lob phrases at them. That's the one thing that I would certainly say. And this is this is not just a humanitarian appeal, right? There is an intellectual reasoning behind it, which is what Rupa's book accomplishes. So thank you so much, Rupa. Thanks for a fantastic session. I know it must be late in Germany now. It's like been 3 hours now.
No, it's...
And thanks to all the viewers. It must be pretty late in Tamil Nadu today, at Chennai or wherever people are joining from. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Aravindan, and thanks to all the audience and for all the wonderful questions. Thank you so much.